Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. I'm Lauren Smith with the International Franchise Association, and we have a great 30 minutes lined up for you. Before we begin, I would like to let everyone know that we are recording today's webinar and will make it available later this evening on community.franchise.org. If you have any questions for today's speakers, please add them to the chat box and they will be addressed towards the end. Today's topic is Funding Fireside Chat, Year in Review and What to Expect in 2022. Here to provide today's discussion is Edith Wiseman, President of FranData, and Eric Schechterman, Chief Development Officer of Benetrends Financial. Thank you, Edith and Eric, for joining us today, and thank you, Benetrends, for sponsoring today's Lunch and Learn. I'll go ahead and turn things over to you, Eric.
All right, thank you, Lauren, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I believe we have about a 30-minute time schedule for today's Lunch and Learn, so we'll try to get through a number of different topics. And again, appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to dedicate some time here to getting some updates on what's going on in the funding world. As mentioned, I am joined today by Edith Wiseman, President of FranData. My name is Eric Schechterman. I am the Chief Development Officer at Benetrends Financial. And really the goal of today is to, and the reason we named it sort of that fireside chat is we really would just want to keep it informal, easy discussion, not get into all the details of all things that are going on in the funding world, but just give you some little tricks of the trade, things to consider as we move into 2022, what we saw, how 2021 ended, and some trends that we see continuing or ending, and really just go over some strategies that'll help you as you grow your brands and look to get your candidates funded here in 2022. So as I mentioned, we're going to really focus on what's trending, what are we seeing with lenders, what are the popular funding strategies that people are utilizing. On the SBA side, what are banks looking for? What are banks looking for from candidates? What are they looking for from different brands that they have an appetite for? What are sort of their hot buttons? Any different strategies for emerging brands versus more established brands? Also spend some time of reminding everybody that it's not only SBA, there are other funding strategies that a lot of candidates and brand utilize to help get over the funding hurdles and really talk about, perception and reality. I feel like there's a lot of confusion around the lending options in the franchise industry and just clarifying some of the most actionable details possible. And that's why I'm so happy to have Edith join us today. I always like spending time talking with people that, rather than what their company does or what industry they're involved in, I just always like to involve people that have their finger on the pulse of certain industries. And with Edith, I think that she's always had a great mind and great perspective of what's going on there with the lenders. And then Benetrends side, we work with them at helping matching brands to those lenders and trying to navigate those waters there. So Edith, thank you so much for joining me today.
Appreciate you inviting me, Eric.
No problem. Well, I'm going to jump right into it because for anyone that's been on an educational webinar or lunch and learn with me, you can know that I do tend to ramble. And with that time limit today, I want to make sure we cover enough topics. But obviously, anywhere we travel, Edith, and I'm sure at the upcoming IFA convention, the question that we're always going to get is, what's going on with SBA? What are the banks looking for? What is an emerging brand? Are they not lending to certain industries? Are they lending to certain industries? But before I get into anything, if somebody just came up to you, Edith, and said, what's your perspective? What's your pulse of how things are going right now when it comes to SBA, the lenders, and just how it relates to the industry of franchise?
Yeah, so Eric, if you could go to the next slide, I think it's helpful to have a perspective of SBA lending over time. When you look at this chart, what this is showing is the 7A loan volume year over year. Now, just keep in mind that SBA follows a different fiscal year than most of us. So they follow an October to September cycle. So when you look at this, I mean, the thing that just leaps off the page is lending volume in 2021. It was a 61% increase over 2020. It's just unprecedented loan volume. And so that's why many of you were experiencing kind of longer processing times, and you can understand why lenders were getting burnt out, is because there was just this tremendous volume that was not experienced in SBA previously. And as of right now, if you can see the last chart, the last bar line, which is fiscal year 2022, that is basically a first quarter of SBA's fiscal year. It looks like the cadence is going to be slightly higher than what the normal cadence is prior to 2021. And, so if you think about, so if you go to the next slide, franchise lending makes up about between 19 to 20% of SBA's loan volume. So it followed that same leap as overall SBA volume in 2021. And when I look at year to year, SBA lending does follow a very a pattern, which is that most of their volume comes in at the same time every year. So each quarter has about 25%, with the exception of 2020 and 2021, which is with the third quarter jammed through about 42% of the loans for the whole year. So the same follows suit. It looks like franchise lending is going to be trending similarly to the way it has prior to 2021. Now, there's something to look out for, which is that 23% of the loans in the SBA's portfolio have been charged off that are franchise loans, which is slightly higher than the actual volume. So that's one of those things, like not a concern right now, but something to look out for to keep our eye out. So that's, I think, the big picture is that there's not going to be as much volume this year as there was last year, which should mean that some of the resources are going to free up and things might be processed a little faster than last year.
Yeah, I know when we're talking about the volume of the loans and we're seeing, upticks here and more lenders, I think the trend that I like to touch on real quick is really just educating brands on understanding SBA and a bank deciding to be an SBA lender and focus on franchising doesn't mean that they focus on all things franchising or every category. One thing that I have seen in my 10 years of being involved in this business, but I feel like it's on hyperdrive for the last 3 or 4 years, is how siloed some of these banks are becoming. And I just always like to educate franchise brands, understanding that banks are businesses. Banks are free to choose how they want to operate.
Can everyone hear me, or was it just Eric? Are you back on?
I am back on. Where did everybody lose me there? Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. All right, well, let's just jump right back into it. As I was saying, the thing to consider is that these banks are businesses. They are very siloed in what they're looking for as far as businesses they want to focus on for lending. I always make the joke, some banks like chocolate, some banks like vanilla. Some banks will literally get as specific in saying, we like to focus on loans that are this size in this industry, and our franchise startups focusing on this type of category. Other lenders, when they choose that, that also means they're saying they are not interested in anything else that's outside of that category. Now, we see it on the Benetrends side from the candidate and submitting those loans to the banks and finding out who has an appetite for what. But I know, Edith, you see it more from the bank side, where banks are often coming to you saying, hey, we want to get into this space. What are some of the things that you hear and seeing things that banks are looking for?
So it is you're right, Eric, it's a confusing landscape for franchisors and franchisees. In just 1 week, I spoke with a bank who will do acquisitions nationwide, but they'll do startups only in their 5-state footprint. And another SBA lender that focuses on small loans under 250 in the senior care space in 3 states and 3 cities. So it's very confusing to find the right fit. But I would say that on the good news side, is that overall what I'm seeing is banks are trying to actively increase their footprint and kind of expand into new markets. So they might expand into a city or just to test out that new market. So if you think about a bank has a footprint where they actually have branches, they're kind of planting new seeds to grow. And I'm seeing that lenders are open up to new industries like home services that they weren't open up to before. And because of what's happened during COVID, on the negative side, there's still a lot of banks who are just not interested in fitness and children's education, sit down restaurants. They're still kind of hot buttons, and they're looking for data to tell them like there's a reason to jump back in.
Yeah, and what I've seen from the appetite side of lenders is, from our end, we've seen a lot of lenders that have focused even on those categories that you mentioned of fitness or education or certain things. And while that's great, it also presents certain challenges because they end up almost cherry picking, knowing that they may be the only game in town. Or what most people don't realize is sometimes, I always like to use that example of an appetite. Sometimes a lender might get too full. There might be a lender that'll say, we're going to focus on this category, and they go on a run for 10 to 12 months of funding everything in that space. And then all of a sudden, one day, for no rhyme or reason, they're going to say, well, we're just going to hit the pause button. Let's see how some of these things play out. So I think the biggest trend that I saw in 2021 that I think will continue in 22 is I do believe that there are more lenders coming to our industry. I believe that there are greater opportunities for loans, but they are very specific in what they are looking for. It's not, I'm looking to put money out there in franchising. It's, I'm looking for this specific type industry, this loan size, and certain things there. And what I still like to remind people of, and Edith, you touched on it as far as specifically the timelines. What we're seeing now, and what I know, Edith, you and I have both seen in our time in this industry, it's actually a pretty normal timeline and process. I think where we got a little spoiled was 2017 to 2019, in my perspective, where banks were just firing approvals out the door. Certain qualifications weren't as important as they have historically been. And I feel like I still get the question of, well, Eric, they didn't used to look for this, or they used to not take this long. And I remind people, no, this is pretty normal. It's the outlier of that 2017 to 19. That was the outlier. So what you saw in 2021, while, as Edith mentioned, we expect that, the effects of the PPP loans and the high volume to maybe have less impact and timelines can return back to a little bit of a speedier timeline, but it's not going to be back to where we were in 2017 to 19, because I don't think that created any positive lending scenarios. Edith, we talked about what the appetites for the lenders are. And I always like to tell people, it's really not as complicated as you think. It really is about a balance between the borrower and the business. So we talk a lot about emerging brands. Edith, from your perspective, what does a lender typically identify as being an emerging brand?
Less than 50 units. So, and actually I would split up emerging brands into 2 categories. I'd split them up into startup and then emerging. So any brand that has kind of less than 10 units would be more startup, and then 10 to 50 is emerging. And, I just counseled my husband's friend who's considering a new franchise that they have a total of 5 locations open. And I told him he's going to have to talk to a curated list of about 5 lenders to be able to see if he could get it to get it financed. And it's going to be 90% reliant on him and 10% on the franchise, which is, still not really a system per se at less than 10 units. But emerging brands, I would say that in this environment, trying to get financed without an item 19 or a bank credit report of sorts, something to tell the lenders of what's going on with the system, it's going to be a challenge. But some visibility into financials is helpful.
Yeah, that's typically the number that we have seen, is that 50 locations. And keep in mind, that's not in development, that is open and operating.
Yeah.
And what I just like to remind brands about is, just because you're not there doesn't mean that there's any knock on your business, but it also means that whatever phenomenal story or phenomenal numbers you may have with the initial few locations or what's been going on right now, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but you just heard Edith say that in this situation, it's going to be 90% on the borrower and 10% on the business. So that's why I always like to say it's a balance between the business and the borrower. So for any emerging brands on the line, I always like to remind them, if SBA is going to be utilized, you really need a more qualified candidate in the eyes of SBA qualifications. This shouldn't, if you have an emerging brand and that person's going to need an SBA loan to effectively move forward with their franchise opportunity, they should not be that marginal person. And I know it's hard with an emerging brand to turn candidates away, but that's one of the biggest trends that I've seen, is really just getting some of these brands to understand that if you are less than 50 locations open, it's really more about the borrower and less about your actual business. And being that that's such a focus, please focus on some of your requirements for the candidates that you're working with. I see too many brands that sort of set these requirements up front, from net worth to liquidity, and then you get a candidate and you see it didn't even match what they even put in their own documents. But it's, oh, well, they really want to do this, or they have X, Y, and Z. So please really focus on that. And that goes to my side of what I've seen working with candidates directly, and trends that we're talking about. Liquidity. Liquidity is the drug of the lenders. They want to see that a borrower on an SBA loan can not only inject whatever amount they need for the loan, typically 20 to 30% of the project cost, but having that candidate have substantial runway left over of available liquid has really become the trend that has applied to all lenders. So this is not money that's dedicated to the business. It's not money that's dedicated to the bank. It's the lender saying, after this candidate injects 20 or 30%, they still have a runway of cash, whether it's in the savings, checking, marketable securities, if they access liquidity through a rollover program. They want to see that that borrower has a good runway to allow this business to grow. And when you're dealing with an emerging brand, I've really seen that liquidity requirement almost become 1.5 times what a bank would look for on a more established brand. As far as some of the hurdles to avoid, and Edith, I want to also see your view of what the banks are looking for from your end on the liquidity side. I've seen that really become one of the biggest hurdles, especially with multi-unit deals and franchise brands not understanding that the multi-unit fees that one pays on a brick and mortar concept, that total franchise fee does not apply when they go to get a loan on location number one. They only get to count the license fee that's dedicated to that first location. And then they can count the additional franchise fees for additional loans down the road. But I see too many brands get candidates in a situation where they pay these franchise fees. Then the bank wants to see that they have more post-closing liquidity, but it's tied up in franchise fees. And you run into people having 3 licenses and no locations, which nobody wants to see. But from your end, Edith, talk about a little bit on the liquid side, or maybe things that you feel that you've seen really the lenders focus on in 2021 and what you see focused on here in 2022.
So I think there's different things based on the type of loan, but I would say that the concepts are the same. So, supply chain costs are an issue, and so are labor. So we're definitely seeing lenders kind of upping the amount that they need for a particular borrower, sometimes by 20 to 30%, underestimating what's they're actually like what the business plan says they need. If it's a construction loan, the problem is the time that folks get a commitment letter when they've gotten bids, those bids change, and so they're aware that those costs are just fluctuating significantly from commitment to closing. And so that does create some time restraints, time hurdles, if there's a construction loan. But I'd say overall, the things that I think lenders want is the truth, as best as you know it, which is the truth around, build out costs and timelines, as I said, things like recovery data. If we ignore 2020, kind of what's the trend? Is it on par with 19? Are we 65% to 19? Are we 85% to 19? These are things that apply both to the borrower. So obviously that's someone has a business, who's getting financed if it's getting sold, but it also applies to the franchise system. So they're looking at both perspectives. That's what we're hearing from lenders that they want to know.
Yeah, and I think when we're looking at the hurdles to avoid or how to get over them, it's a good transition to really focusing on just strategies that franchise brands can implement. I already saw one of the questions of, as a startup with an item 19, what are some things that we can do to help potentials? And that's actually what we're going to talk about right now, because a lot of this, from waiting too long to get a candidate pre-qualified, knowing if they're going to need collateral, how their employment status may impact the loan, not being aware of other options for the candidate, or even just leaving it to the candidate, which we know what happens there. They're going to crash the bus if you give them the keys to the bus. So really making it easy, and Edith, you touched on it, of just providing data, making it information available to the lenders, making the candidate aware of what they need to know about, are some of the strategies that we've seen a lot of the emerging brands and even established brands utilize to really secure their lending in the current environment. So I know on one end we talk about data and making it an easy decision for a lender. Not saying that it makes the business look better, but as a underwriter, I like data and I want items in front of me. So whether it's having an item 19, as Edith mentioned, a fund score, the franchise registry, some of these different tools. Edith, can you talk about some of the strategies you've seen brands utilize through some of the data that FranData provides?
Yeah, so I think, to give perspective, talking to lenders all the time about what's in their portfolio. I recently had a lender tell me the only franchise that failed in his portfolio was a specific brand. And, when I dug into it, I said, well, that brand has a 65% historic unit success rate. So the chances were pretty high that the loan wasn't going to succeed. And they had an extremely high transfer rate, which means that franchisees were unsatisfied with their franchise system. So there's tools that the lenders use that you need to be aware of about how they're making decisions. And if there's information that you can bring to bear that can help the lender better understand your franchise system credit worthiness, it will go a long way to them getting comfortable with the credit profile. So that's what the franchise credit score is. But I will say, Eric, just touching on the startup loans, the problem is that not every lender does startups, like I mentioned earlier. So it is really important to work with someone that actually can help you identify those banks that will do startups. And when I say startups, it means first-time business owner, first-time business, not a existing franchisee opening up the second location or third location. Those are easier to get financed on a general basis.
Yeah, so I think anything from the fund score, the registry, but being that we're talking about the registry, I'm sure you probably deal with this 10 times the amount that I do. The confusion around what is this registry, or I'm on this system, or even understanding that if I'm on it, what it actually means and how it applies. I know that obviously you have a lot of background here, so there's a lot of confusion around the SBA Directory and the Franchise Registry. For everyone that's on the line, could you just educate us here on some of the things that the brand should understand and know?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the SBA created a directory where they're approving a brand's ability to obtain financing. So it says a brand's franchisees can obtain financing because they are not overly controlling and because the business model is eligible as a small business. But it doesn't tell a bank whether they should finance a franchise. So I would say, the challenge about lenders is you think of them as like a thing, one thing, but you really have to think of them as individual roles and responsibilities. So you have BDOs who are going to tell you everything. We can finance you, I promise. Then you've got the credit underwriters. I'm completely throwing them under the bus. I love BDOs. But then you've got credit officers who are going to tend to say no. And then you've got portfolio managers who are the ones dictating policy around the ability to finance. So I would say the big distinction between the Franchise Directory by SBA and the Franchise Registry is one says you can, and then the Franchise Registry helps lenders decide whether they should obtain financing. And so a brand has an ability to influence a lender's decision by providing more information through the registry.
Yes, and for those of you that are on the line, and many brands will, one of their first things will be to get on the SBA Directory. But as Edith mentioned, that is not a blanket approval for all SBA lenders to say you should finance this opportunity. The amount of candidates that, or franchise brands that I work with that say, well, why is this a problem? We're on the directory. That is not a blanket approval for every lender to say this is a business you lend to. Remember, banks are businesses. What the directory is telling them is this can get an SBA loan. And as Edith mentioned, then there's an aspect of should that bank do that loan, and whether it's gathering more information on the business through certain data reports, funds scores, looking at the candidate. That is really where certain strategies come into play that you should really be focused on. Establishing funding relationships, whether it's with a funding partner, whether it's with local banks that you've already funded multiple businesses through. I see so many different franchise brands miss some of the low-hanging fruit opportunities to make lending an easier process. As Edith mentioned, having a funding partner that knows the appetite of the lenders, going to a funding company and saying, here's our concept, here's our FDD, here's all these items, here's the investment range. Those funding partners should know what banks would have an appetite for that loan. And then we'll begin to work with lenders on those candidates. So you don't have a candidate going to 5 banks, getting declined and thinking there's something wrong with your business, when in all reality, they probably just went to the wrong bank. So it's really establishing relationships that know how to find the lenders. 2, I know on the Benetrends side, we work with so many brands where we're essentially like the finance back of the house. And it costs them nothing to do it with most funding companies. We pre-qualify candidates. There's tools that you can implement into your website, from funding calculators, pre-qualification, also educating your development team of knowing what to look for, what funding programs to be aware of, working together to build a business plan that will appeal to the lenders, having the data on your brand from FranData reports, the funds score. All of these things go exactly to that one question that I see in the chat box. What can we do to help potentials? You want to make this an easy decision for the underwriter, for the BDO. So really creating those relationships, which more times than not really cost you nothing. It's just about finding the right partner to work with.
And Eric, I'll just add one more thing. Make sure to arm your lending partner with information about the banks who are experiencing failures or defaults. So if you have franchisees that you know are starting to go down, you don't want to waste your funding partner's time, because they might actually send that loan to a bank and they might not know that it's going to be a no before you even got started. And so that is, I think, really an important helpful tool to your lending partner.
Yeah, and listen, the IFA has done so many fantastic processes to identify multiple funding partners throughout the country. So whether it's Benetrends or any funding partner that's out there, that's what they should be primarily focused on, is understanding your brand, giving you tools to make this process easier, work with your candidates, be that funding back of the house. And as we wrap up, as I know as we're getting to the end point of our call today, obviously, again, regardless if it's Benetrends or any of the providers that offer this service, remember, SBA is not the only way. Whether we're seeing lenders that have an appetite for equipment leasing, we see more people leveraging home equity lines of credit. And of course, I always like to remind people, remember, there is a strategy where people can use retirement funds without having to pay any tax or penalty to fund a business. And sometimes that's combining it with other options. The best thing that I can ever tell a brand is, you're the expert on your brand, get the funding experts to help you with the funding, and those two work together. Don't try to check both boxes on your own. And so if you utilize these strategies and utilize the resources that are out there, I really think that you'll make funding a much easier process here in 2022. Thank you so much for joining us. Lauren, I know we're right at the end point, but I'm happy to stay on to answer any other questions. Again, my name is Eric Schecterman, Chief Development Officer at Benetrends Financial. Edith, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to hear from you and, of course, see you in sunny San Diego in a few weeks.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Edith and Eric. This was excellent content and excellent feedback from all of you. We really do appreciate it. Again, this webinar was recorded, and along with the presentation deck will appear on the website early this evening. You'll be able to find that at community.franchise.org. Thank you very much again to Edith, Eric, and the Benetrends team. And again, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe and healthy. Bye.